The galaxy thought warfare was an equation to be perfectly balanced. To the sovereign fleet, combat was a clean, mathematical certainty. They possessed superior plasma matrices, impenetrable kinetic shields, and a flawless victory record spanning 5 millennia. They believed they had perfected the art of the kill. Then, humanity entered the theater. We didn't bring elegant equations or clean energy. We brought armor 2 meters thick, uranium-tipped fury, and a stubborn refusal to die. They mastered war. We mastered survival. The transition from slipspace back into real space was never gentle on a dreadnought. The UNS Gettysburg shuddered violently, its massive titanium frame groaning as the laws of physics reasserted themselves across 2 million metric tons of armor and weaponry. Deep in the bowels of the ship, the fusion drives roared, vibrating through the heavy deck plates and straight into the boots of every man and woman on board. Captain Thomas Harding gripped the edges of the command console, waiting for the structural rattling to subside. The air on the bridge was thick with the smell of ozone, hot copper, and the bitter scent of old coffee. There were no sleek holographic interfaces or sweeping glass observation decks here. The bridge was buried deep in the center of the ship, wrapped in 30 meters of solid ablative plating. Information came through rugged, physical screens and heavy tactile switches. "Slipspace rupture complete," helmsman Peter Owens reported, his voice tight but professional. "Engines reading stable. We are holding position at the edge of the Gamma Pavonis gravity well." "Tactical, give me eyes," Harding ordered, stepping back from the console. He was a man worn down by years of service, his uniform practical, unadorned, and slightly frayed at the cuffs, bringing up long-range optics and passive sensors. Tactical Officer David Miller replied, his fingers flying across a bank of heavy mechanical keyboards. "Suppressing active radar. We're running cold and silent. They shouldn't know we're here yet." The primary viewing screen flickered to life. The image was grainy for a fraction of a second before the processing algorithms sharpened the feed. The bridge crew fell into a heavy, oppressive silence. Harding crossed his arms, staring at the feed. The orbital defense platforms surrounding the mining colony of New Roanoke were gone. In their place hung expanding clouds of superheated gas and jagged, blackened debris. Below the debris field, the colony itself was burning. High-altitude strikes had shattered the atmosphere scrubbers, and massive firestorms were sweeping across the northern hemisphere, visible even from the edge of the system. Hanging in low orbit above the dying world were the architects of the destruction. 3 heavy cruisers of the sovereign fleet. They were beautiful, terrifying machines. Smooth, teardrop shapes made of a pristine, silver-white alloy that seemed to catch the starlight and bend it. There were no visible thrusters, no weapon ports, no jagged edges. They moved with absolute, silent grace, completely at odds with the brute force mechanics of human engineering. "Confirm targets," Harding said, his voice dropping to a low, steady register. 3 sovereign cruisers, Miller confirmed, reading the telemetry cascading down his secondary monitor. "Energy signatures match the profiles we received from the distress beacon. They are running active scanning sweeps, but their focus is entirely directed at the planetary surface. They're bombarding the remaining civilian shelters." "Shields?" First Officer Rachel Collins asked, stepping up to Harding's side. She kept her eyes glued to the telemetry, her expression hard. "Active," Miller replied. "Standard sovereign configuration. Electromagnetic repulsor fields layered over thermal dispersion matrices. Our intelligence says those shields can absorb gigajoules of directed energy without so much as a fluctuation." Harding slowly nodded. The sovereign fleet had never fought humanity before. They had spent the last 1,000 years subjugating smaller, energy-dependent star systems. They fought with lasers, particle beams, and plasma projectors. Their shields were specifically designed to dissipate heat and deflect charged particles. They treated warfare like a game of chess, where the piece with the higher energy output simply removed the weaker piece from the board. They didn't understand the concept of raw, unadulterated kinetic trauma. "They think they've won," Collins noted, pointing to a tactical overlay showing the enemy cruisers breaking their tight formation, drifting lazily apart as they picked off ground targets. "They aren't even watching their six. Their localized radar is operating on narrow band frequencies, because nobody has ever snuck up on them," Harding said, a grim shadow passing over his face. "Nobody has ever survived the first volley to counterattack. They expect clean lines of fire and honorable energy duels." Harding turned his back to the screen and looked at his crew. "Owens, lay in an intercept course. Bring us up to 1/4 impulse. Keep our emissions baffled. We slide in through the debris field of the defense platforms. Use the wreckage to mask our thermal bloom. Aye, Captain. Baffling drives. Setting course." "Miller," Harding continued, looking at his tactical officer. "Spin up the main spinal mounts. I want slugs loaded in tubes 1 through 4. Depleted uranium cores. Tungsten jacketing. Disengage the safeties on the magnetic accelerator coils. We are going to overcharge the rails." Miller looked up, his eyes widening slightly. "Captain, overcharging the rails will burn out the magnetic guides after 1 volley. We'll be left with secondary batteries and torpedoes. If we don't break those shields on the first volley, David, we won't live to fire a second," Harding stated flatly. "Load the heavy rounds. Do it manually if the autoloaders complain about the mass." "Yes, sir. Loading high-mass kinetic penetrators." The sound of massive hydraulic lifts engaging echoed faintly through the deck, a rhythmic thudding that felt like a slow heartbeat. Deep in the magazines, shells the size of city buses were being hoisted into the firing chambers of the Gettysburg's dual railguns. "Collins," Harding said, his tone shifting to absolute iron. "Seal the ship. Drop the blast doors across all decks. Vent the outer compartments of atmosphere. If they hit us with plasma, I don't want oxygen feeding the fires." "Sealing ship," Collins acknowledged, her hands moving expertly over the damage control boards. Heavy mechanical alarms chimed softly across the bridge as physical steel bulkheads slammed shut, locking the crew into isolated survival zones. Harding stepped back to the command chair but didn't sit down. He watched the main screen as the Gettysburg crept closer, drifting silently like a massive iron predator in the dark. The pristine, silver shapes of the sovereign cruisers grew larger, their hulls completely unmarred by the chaotic reality of the universe. They were perfect. They were mathematical. They were about to learn physics. "Distance to optimal firing range is 30,000 kilometers, Owens whispered, as if speaking too loudly might alert the aliens. 20 seconds to firing solution." "Hold your fire until we clear the debris," Harding ordered, his knuckles white as he gripped the chair. "Let them see us." Aboard the lead sovereign cruiser, designated the Luminous Path, Fleet Director Croft stood in the center of a spotless, glowing command sphere. He was tall, his features angular and sharp, draped in the pristine white uniform that signified absolute authority. Holographic data streams orbited him like obedient satellites, projecting the flawless efficiency of his fleet. "Planetary resistance has dropped below 2%, his tactical overseer reported, the alien's voice calm and melodious. "The remaining primitive structures are burning. The indigenous population lacks the thermal shielding necessary to survive the plasma saturation." Croft dismissed the data with a slight wave of his hand. It was hardly a war. It was pest control. These newly discovered bipeds, humans they called themselves, had expanded too far, intruding into the sovereign space of his people. The High Council had ordered an immediate cleansing. Croft had executed it perfectly. Not a single point of damage had been registered across his 3 cruisers. "Sir," The sensor operative spoke up, a hint of confusion breaking the otherwise serene atmosphere of the bridge. "We are detecting an anomaly in the orbital debris field. Sector 4. Croft frowned, pulling the sensor feed toward him with a gesture. "A surviving defense platform? I ordered them completely vaporized." "Negative, Director. It is not a platform. It is a vessel. It just appeared from behind the wreckage of the primary orbital station." A physical screen materialized before Croft. He stared at the image, utterly baffled. It was a ship, but unlike anything he had ever seen. It was horrifyingly ugly. There were no graceful curves, no luminescent energy veins, no aesthetic symmetry. It was a massive, brutalist slab of dark grey metal, covered in jagged sensor antennae, heavy armor plating, and thick, protruding barrels. It looked like a tool designed by a barbarian, welded together from raw iron and spite. "Energy readings?" Croft asked, almost amused by the sheer blockiness of the design. "Minimal, Director," the operative replied. "They have no plasma reserves, no active thermal matrices. Their propulsion seems to be based on primitive chemical and nuclear reactions." "Sir, they don't even have a deflector shield." A soft chuckle rippled across the command sphere. To fly through the void without an energy shield was tantamount to suicide. A single micrometeorite strike at fractional light speed could core a ship. "Target the vessel," Croft sighed, disappointed by the sheer lack of challenge. "Reroute power to the primary plasma lance. Let us demonstrate the futility of their engineering. Burn them." On the bridge of the Gettysburg, the threat receivers screamed. "Active lock!" Miller shouted over the blaring klaxons. "Targeting lasers painting our hull. Massive thermal spikes detected on the lead cruiser. They're venting plasma into their main firing aperture." "Range?" Harding barked, his eyes locked on the screen. 25,000 kilometers. We are inside their firing envelope." "Brace for impact!" Harding roared, grabbing the heavy handrails of his console. In the cold silence of space, the Sovereign cruiser fired. A blinding, coherent beam of superheated plasma, burning hotter than the surface of a star, bridged the gap between the two ships in a fraction of a second. The plasma lance struck the Gettysburg dead center on its forward glacis. Aboard the alien ship, Croft watched the telemetry, waiting for the inevitable vaporization of the primitive vessel. His plasma lances were designed to instantly boil away hull material, turning the target's own mass into an explosive gas that would tear the ship apart from the inside out. But the Gettysburg didn't vaporize. The human dreadnought shuddered violently. The outer layer of ablative armor, a highly classified ceramic titanium composite designed specifically to flash boil and shed heat, did exactly what it was engineered to do. The immense thermal energy of the plasma beam hit the armor, melted the outer crust, and was violently blown away from the hull, taking the heat with it. Beneath the ablative layer lay 2 solid meters of dense, heavy tungsten plating. Inside the bridge, the temperature spiked instantly. Crew members sweat through their uniforms as the environmental scrubbers whined in protest, but the bulkheads held. The heavy, physical shock absorbers, buried deep in the ship's skeleton, absorbed the kinetic transfer of the blast. "Damage report," Harding demanded, coughing through a haze of smoke that had vented from a blown fuse box. "Forward armor depleted by 30%, Collins reported, reading the damage control boards. "Hull integrity holding at 98%. We have localized melting on decks 4 through 7, but the vacuum seals are holding tight. They didn't punch through." Harding grinned, a feral, terrifying expression. "They shot their bolt. Miller, fire!" Miller slammed his hand down on the heavy, red firing stud. "Firing main guns!" Deep within the Gettysburg, immense capacitors dumped gigawatts of electrical power into the magnetic rails. The entire length of the dreadnought became a giant gun barrel, The physical kickback was so severe that the massive ship was actually pushed backward in space, its thrusters firing wildly to compensate for the recoil. 2 heavy tungsten-jacketed depleted uranium slugs, each weighing over 4,000 kilograms, left the rails at a measurable fraction of the speed of light. There was no glowing beam. There was no bright flash of light. In the vacuum of space, kinetic energy was invisible right up until the very moment of impact. Aboard the luminous path, Croft's sensor operative only had time to register a massive gravitational distortion. Director, high-mass objects approaching it. The human rounds struck the Sovereign cruiser's shields. The electromagnetic repulsor fields were designed to scatter energy and deflect charged particles. They were utterly useless against raw, uncharged, hypervelocity mass. The first round punched through the shield as if it wasn't there, shattering the localized matrix into a storm of useless static. It struck the elegant, curved hull of the cruiser. The silver alloy, so perfectly crafted, shattered like cheap glass. The depleted uranium penetrator cored through the ship, instantly vaporizing the internal bulkheads through sheer kinetic friction, passing entirely through the cruiser, and exiting out the rear engine block in a massive bloom of atmosphere and shredded metal. The second round hit a microsecond later, striking the primary plasma containment field. The luminous path, the pride of the Sovereign fleet, didn't just explode. It was physically ripped in half by the sheer concussive trauma. The majestic vessel broke apart into millions of tumbling, dead pieces of scrap, venting its atmosphere and its crew into the freezing void in absolute silence. On the bridge of the Gettysburg, the crew watched the screen as the alien dreadnought ceased to exist. Harding didn't celebrate. He didn't cheer. He just wiped a drop of sweat from his forehead and looked at Miller. "Cycle the autoloaders," Harding ordered, his voice cold and steady. "Target the second cruiser. Let's finish this." The destruction of the luminous path registered on the tactical displays of the remaining 2 Sovereign cruisers, not as a battle casualty, but as a catastrophic system error. Their onboard analytical engines, programmed with thousands of years of continuous energy warfare data, simply could not process what had just occurred. A premier warship, enveloped in a multi-layered electromagnetic defense matrix, had gone from full operational capacity to scattered particulate matter in less than 2 seconds. Aboard the harmonic resonance, Commander Hale stared at the empty space where his fleet director had been floating moments before. The pristine white command sphere was dead silent, save for the soft, rhythmic chime of a localized proximity alert. The holographic displays were struggling to track the expanding debris field, the sensors completely blinded by the sudden, violent introduction of raw kinetic fragmentation. "Update the telemetry," Hale ordered. His voice lacked the melodic calm of his predecessor. It was brittle, edged with something the Sovereign officers hadn't felt in generations. Panic. "Sensors are attempting to compensate, Commander," the tactical overseer replied, his long fingers hovering hesitantly over his interface. "The localized radar is choked with microshrapnel. The human vessel, it is obscured by the wreckage of our flagship." "Did they deploy a spatial rupture weapon?" Hale demanded, stepping closer to the central projection. "A gravitational singularity? What bypassed the thermal shields? Negative on spatial anomalies. The telemetry logs from the luminous path transmitted a final microsecond burst of data before obliteration." The overseer pulled up a harsh, jagged graph that completely ruined the aesthetic symmetry of the bridge. It was solid mass, ultra-dense, uncharged. Our repulsor fields attempted to scatter the energy, but there was no energy to scatter. It was purely physical trauma. Hale processed the information, his mind rebelling against the sheer barbarism of the concept, throwing solid rocks at a starship. It was an insult to the very concept of advanced warfare. "They weaponized dead matter," he whispered, "They are reloading," the overseer stated, a sudden urgency spiking in his tone. "Thermal blooms detected deep within their hull. They are generating massive electrical charges." "Break formation!" Hale shouted, abandoning protocol. "Evasive patterns! Divert all reserve power from the forward thermal shields to the sublight engines. If their weapons rely on physical mass, they are bound by standard trajectory mechanics. We simply outmaneuver the projectiles. Target their propulsion systems and fire at will." Across the void, the UNS Gettysburg was completely blind to the aliens' tactical adjustments, and Captain Harding didn't care. He was too busy managing a warship that was currently trying to tear itself apart from the inside. Down in the magazine decks, the reality of overcharging the magnetic rails was making itself known. The heavy autoloader mechanisms, massive robotic arms designed to hoist the 4,000-kilogram tungsten slugs into the firing chambers, were grinding in protest. Chief Engineer Arthur Reynolds slammed a heavy iron wrench against a jammed hydraulic actuator, sending a shower of sparks across the grated floor of the armory. The air down here was sweltering, thick with the smell of scorched ozone and vaporized lubricant. "Bypass the primary safety locks!" Reynolds yelled over the deafening mechanical roar of the ship. He pointed a grease-stained finger at his secondary technician. "The recoil warped the guide rails on Tube 2. The slug is caught on the loading tray." "If we bypass the safeties, the breach might not seal perfectly," the technician shouted back, wiping sweat from his eyes. "We could blow the chamber. If we don't get around in that tube, the aliens are going to turn this ship into a floating oven." Reynolds grabbed a heavy manual override lever, planting his boots firmly on the deck plating. "On 3, you vent the hydraulic pressure, and I force the rammer. 1, 2, 3. A loud metallic shriek echoed through the magazine as the massive tungsten slug was violently shoved into the firing chamber. The heavy steel breech block slammed shut with a finality that shook the deck plates. "Bridge, this is engineering," Reynolds barked into his shoulder-mounted comms unit. "Tubes 1 and 2 are loaded, but the rails are running dangerously hot. You fire another overcharged volley like that, and you're going to melt the magnetic coils into slag." Up on the bridge, Harding acknowledged the report with a curt nod. "Understood, Chief. We only need them to hold together a little longer." "Captain," Miller interrupted, his eyes glued to the tactical display. "The remaining 2 cruisers are breaking their static hover. They are accelerating rapidly, diverging on an intersecting axis. They're trying to flank us." "They figured out the rail guns," Collins noted, watching the telemetry. "They know we need a straight line of sight to hit them. They're going to use their superior sublight speed to stay out of our firing arc." "Let them try," Harding said, leaning forward. "Owens, cut the main fusion drive. Kill our forward momentum entirely." The helmsman looked back, bewildered. "Sir, if we drop our speed, we become a static target. They're already painting us with targeting lasers. We are currently flying through an expanding cloud of vaporized titanium and shattered alien hull plating," Harding explained, his voice low and dangerous. "If we push through it, we expose ourselves. If we stop, we stay hidden inside their own dead ship's radar shadow. Kill the drive." "Drive killed," Owens complied, his hands pulling back the heavy thrust levers. The constant, reassuring vibration of the massive engines died away, leaving the bridge in an eerie, suspended stillness. "Miller," Harding continued, "do not track them with the ship. Keep the nose pointed dead ahead. Let them think we're slow to react. Wait until they cross our firing plane." "Multiple thermal spikes detected," Collins shouted, gripping her console. "They're firing." A barrage of concentrated particle beams tore through the blackness of space, slicing through the expanding debris field of the luminous path. Unlike the heavy plasma lances, these beams were rapid fire, designed to strip away armor, layer by layer, rather than trying to melt it all at once. The Gettysburg shuddered violently as the first volley struck. The forward ablative armor, already compromised by the initial plasma strike, began to crack and slough off in massive glowing chunks. Warning klaxons howled across the bridge as localized temperature readings spiked into the red. "Armor failing on decks 2 and 3, Collins reported, her voice straining over the noise of the alarms. "They're trying to core our forward sensor arrays. Hold position," Harding ordered, his eyes fixed on the primary screen. The two Sovereign cruisers were sweeping wide, moving with terrifying speed and agility. They didn't bank or roll like human ships. They simply altered their vectors instantaneously, defying standard inertia through advanced gravimetric dampeners. "Taking heavy hits to the forward glacis. Tungsten plating is holding, but it's superheating. If it reaches melting point, it will compromise the inner bulkheads. Hold position," Harding repeated, his jaw clenched tight. The heavy dreadnought rocked again, a deep, resonant booming sound echoing through the hull as another volley of particle beams scoured the ship's nose. The lights on the bridge flickered, and a shower of sparks erupted from a secondary monitor overhead. The Sovereign cruisers were closing the distance, their confidence clearly returning. They were pouring fire into the stationary human vessel, stripping away its ugly exterior, entirely convinced that the lumbering beast was too sluggish to track their elegant maneuvers. "They are crossing the 20,000-kilometer mark," Miller reported, his fingers resting heavily on the firing controls. "Angle of approach is 30 degrees and closing." "Owens," Harding said, his tone suddenly shifting from patient to razor-sharp. "Roll the ship 90 degrees to port. Present fresh armor on the starboard side. And as soon as we roll, engage the starboard maneuvering thrusters at maximum burn. Rolling ship. Thrusters engaging." The Gettysburg didn't try to turn its massive bulk to chase the agile alien cruisers. Instead, the heavy dreadnought violently spun on its longitudinal axis. The heavily damaged top armor rotated away, presenting a completely untouched slab of 2-meter-thick tungsten to the incoming fire. Simultaneously, the massive chemical thrusters on the starboard side erupted in a violent sequence of controlled explosions. Newtonian physics took over. In the frictionless vacuum of space, the immense lateral thrust kicked the nose of the Gettysburg hard to the left, swinging the entire ship like a massive iron baseball bat. The sudden, brutal maneuver snapped the nose of the dreadnought directly into the flight path of the harmonic resonance. Commander Hale, aboard his pristine bridge, saw the ugly grey slab of the human ship suddenly snap into view on his primary display. It didn't make sense. A ship of that mass should have taken minutes to alter its vector, but by using raw, explosive chemical thrust, they had simply kicked the front of their ship into alignment. "They have a firing solution," Hale's tactical officer screamed. "Miller!" Harding roared. "Fire!" The magnetic rails screamed as the Gettysburg discharged its second volley. The immense recoil halted the ship's lateral spin instantly, the opposing forces jarring the crew hard against their harnesses. 2 more 4,000-kilogram depleted uranium slugs tore across the void. Hale had ordered evasive maneuvers, but his ship was moving too fast on its current vector. The gravimetric dampeners could alter their course, but they couldn't instantly negate the forward momentum of the cruiser. The first slug missed, passing a mere 50 meters across the bow of the harmonic resonance, a terrifying phantom of invisible kinetic death. The second slug did not miss. It struck the Sovereign cruiser on its port-side engine nacelle. The alien shields, completely ineffective against the solid mass, allowed the projectile to pass unhindered. The tungsten-jacketed round smashed into the delicate, hyper-advanced antimatter propulsion ring. There was no clean penetration this time. The sheer density of the engine block arrested the slug's momentum just enough to transfer all of its kinetic energy directly into the cruiser's frame. The harmonic resonance violently crumpled inward. The port side of the beautiful, teardrop-shaped hull shattered into millions of jagged fragments. The sheer concussive shockwave ripped through the pristine corridors, instantly liquefying the crew through overpressure before the vacuum of space could even claim them. The antimatter containment field housed within the engine ring destabilized. "Hard to starboard! Full impulse!" Harding shouted, foreseeing the catastrophic chain reaction. The Gettysburg's main fusion drives ignited, kicking the heavy dreadnought forward and away just as the harmonic resonance detonated. It wasn't a localized explosion. The containment failure triggered a localized spatial fracture, a blinding sphere of pure white light that expanded outward, consuming everything within a 10-kilometer radius. The shockwave hit the Gettysburg seconds later. The dreadnought groaned as the blast wave washed over its stern, the heavy shock absorbers bottoming out with a sickening crunch. Men and women on the bridge were thrown violently against their stations. When the light faded, Harding pulled himself back up to his command monitor. His left arm was bruised, and he could taste copper in his mouth, but his eyes were locked on the tactical feed. The second cruiser was gone, replaced by a lingering cloud of radioactive dust. Only one sovereign ship remained. It had ceased its attack and was currently sitting dead in space, hovering over the burning atmosphere of the human colony, perfectly still. "Damage report," Harding grunted, wiping a thin line of blood from his chin. "We've lost main sensors," Collins reported, her hands flying over the manual backups. "Armor on the starboard aft quarter is severely compromised. Engineering reports the magnetic rails on tubes 1 and 2 are fused solid. We can't fire the main guns again." Harding stared at the lone alien vessel on the grainy optical feed. The equation of war had changed, and both sides knew it. The final cruiser wasn't retreating, and it wasn't attacking. It was waiting. The silence hanging in the space above New Roanoke was heavy, pregnant with the kind of tension that precedes a final, fatal blow. The expanding dust cloud of the destroyed harmonic resonance drifted lazily across the void, a highly radioactive graveyard of shattered silver alloy and frozen atmosphere. On the edge of that debris field, the UNS Gettysburg sat like a bruised heavyweight fighter catching its breath. Aboard the final sovereign cruiser, the Aegis, Commander Reed stared at the tactical projections. His bridge, identical in its pristine, luminescent geometry to the ones that had just been vaporized, felt suddenly vulnerable. The soft, melodic hum of the ship's systems offered no comfort. 2 standard bearers of his fleet, vessels that had subjugated entire star systems without ever registering a hull breach, had been systematically dismantled by a crude, blocky slab of industrial iron. "Report on the human vessel," Reed ordered. His voice was tightly controlled, stripping away the usual arrogance of his rank. "They have ceased all forward acceleration," the tactical overseer replied, his hands tracing the holographic readouts with rapid, nervous gestures. Thermal scans indicate a catastrophic heat buildup in their forward superstructure. The energy signatures from their primary kinetic accelerators have flatlined. Their launch rails are fused. Reed allowed a slow, measured breath to escape his lungs. The analytical engines were finally piecing together the logic of the human war machine. It was a weapon of brute force, relying on massive chemical and electrical spikes to hurl dead mass. But such primitive mechanics came with a cost. The friction, the recoil, the sheer stress on the materials, the human ship was tearing itself apart just to fire. "They possess no long-range capability," Reed concluded, stepping toward the primary viewing sphere. "Their armor is heavily degraded on multiple vectors. They are attempting to mask their thermal bleeding, but the structural fractures are evident. Commander, we should withdraw and request a heavy bombardment flotilla," the overseer suggested, a rare note of hesitation in his tone. The mathematical probability of their survival was calculated at 0. The variance is too high. "We do not retreat from a species that uses combustion to traverse the void," Reed snapped, his eyes narrowing at the ugly grey vessel on the screen. "Their main weapons are dead. They are a floating target. Divert all secondary power to the lateral gravimetric dampeners. We will close the distance, but we will not fly on a predictable axis. We will maintain a corkscrew trajectory, staying entirely outside of their fixed firing arcs. Target their life support and environmental scrubbers. Let them suffocate in their iron box." On the bridge of the Gettysburg, the atmosphere was decidedly less analytical. It was sweltering, chaotic, and smelled of melted plastic and raw adrenaline. The emergency lighting bathed the heavy steel bulkheads in a harsh, pulsing amber glow. "Coolant lines on Deck 4 are completely severed," Collins reported, shouting over the roar of the atmospheric recyclers trying to filter out electrical smoke. "Engineering is manually capping the valves, but we are losing pressure in the forward magazine. Seal the deck," Harding ordered, leaning heavily over the central plotting table. "Evacuate the damage control teams to the secondary junctions. If the residual heat from the rails reaches the remaining uranium stockpiles, we won't need the aliens to blow us up." "Captain," Miller interrupted, his eyes locked on the heavily distorted sensor feed. "The final cruiser is on the move. They aren't trying to flank us this time. They are diving straight toward our position, but their vector is erratic. They are running a high-speed spiral pattern. They know the spinal mounts are dead," Harding muttered, tracing a finger across the projected trajectory of the enemy ship. "They know we can't track them with the whole ship fast enough to line up another railgun shot. They want to get into our blind spots and carve us up with precision fire." "Range is 15,000 kilometers and closing rapidly," Owens added, his hands resting on the thruster controls, ready for an order to dodge. "Hold our position," Harding said. "Sir." Owens looked back, his face streaked with sweat and soot. "If we stay static, they'll pick our armor apart. Our ablative plating is gone, and the tungsten is fractured," Harding explained, his voice projecting a grim calm. "If we try to outmaneuver them with chemical thrusters, we'll just expose the weakened sections of our hull. We let them come to us." Harding turned to Miller. "David, bring the secondary batteries online, all of them. The 120mm autocannons, the point defense flak grids, and flood the tubes on the ship-to-ship heavy torpedoes. Captain, secondary batteries have a maximum effective range of 3,000 kilometers, Miller cautioned, his hands flying across the tactile switches to awaken the ship's close-range arsenal. "Their shields will easily deflect the smaller autocannon rounds, and their point defense lasers will shoot down our torpedoes before they cover half that distance." "I know," Harding said, a cold, hard glint in his eye. "Which is why we aren't going to fire at 3,000 kilometers. We are going to wait until they are right on top of us." Collins looked up from her damage reports. "You want to draw them into a knife fight?" "They think warfare is an equation," Harding replied, staring at the screen as the elegant, silver teardrop shape of the Aegis grew larger. "They think it's clean. Let's show them how ugly it gets when you have to look your enemy in the eye." The Aegis descended upon the Gettysburg like a bird of prey, circling a wounded behemoth. Commander Reed watched with grim satisfaction as his cruiser effortlessly danced around the lumbering dreadnought. At 10,000 kilometers, he ordered the first surgical strike. 3 concentrated particle beams lanced out from the pristine hull of the sovereign ship. They did not aim for the thickest parts of the tungsten armor. The analytical engines had already mapped the fractures from the previous engagements. The beams struck the Gettysburg on its dorsal ridge, cleanly slicing through an entire bank of long-range communication arrays and secondary sensor clusters. Deep inside the human ship, the concussive force of the impact rattled the deck plates, sending loose tools and unsecured gear clattering across the grating. The bridge shuddered, the lights flickering violently before the backup generators kicked in. "Dorsal sensors are gone," Collins shouted, her hands moving frantically to reroute the telemetry through the aft camera feeds. We are effectively blind on the top hemisphere. Hull integrity on Deck 9 is compromised. Emergency bulkheads have sealed the breach. But we have lost 2 crew members to the vacuum. Harding gripped the edge of the console, his jaw set like stone. He didn't blink. He didn't offer a word of warning. There was no time. Keep the power routed to the broadside autoloaders. Do not return fire. Let them think our fire control systems are offline. The Aegis closed to 8,000 kilometers, continuing its erratic, spiraling descent. Another volley of particle beams flashed across the void. This time, they struck the portside thruster housing. The heavy ceramic casing shattered, sending chunks of debris spinning out into the darkness. "Port thrusters unresponsive," Owens reported, wrestling with the manual yokes as the ship listed slightly from the kinetic impact of the beams. "We are dead in the water, Captain. We can't even spin the ship anymore." "Perfect," Harding whispered. Aboard the Aegis, the tactical overseer spoke up, his tone reflecting a return to the clinical detachment that defined sovereign warfare. "The human vessel is completely immobilized. Forward weapons are offline. We have severed their primary sensor links and lateral propulsion. They are a derelict." Reed allowed himself a thin smile. "Cease spiral evasion. Bring us in along their port broadside, 0 inclination. Align the primary plasma lance. We will core the center of their vessel and end this." The Aegis dropped its evasive maneuvers. Believing the target to be entirely helpless, the elegant silver cruiser glided smoothly into a parallel formation with the Gettysburg, hovering a mere 1,000 kilometers away. It was practically point-blank range for starships. The glowing aperture of the sovereign plasma lance began to illuminate, gathering the immense thermal energy required for the executioner's blow. "They've stopped dancing," Miller yelled, his eyes glued to the optical feed. "They are matching our drift. Range is 1,000 kilometers. "Now, Miller!" Harding roared, his voice echoing off the steel walls of the bridge. "Give them everything!" The port side of the Gettysburg erupted in a continuous, deafening wall of fire. The ship's heavy iron panels, completely untouched by the previous engagements, slid open to reveal 36 heavy 120mm autocannons and a grid of heavy torpedo tubes. The Sovereign shields were designed to dissipate directed energy and deflect high-mass, hypervelocity slugs. They were completely unprepared for grid fire flak. Hundreds of artillery shells left the broadside cannons every second. They were not designed to pierce the alien shields. They were proximity-fused. As the storm of shells reached the electromagnetic boundary of the Aegis, they detonated simultaneously. Millions of jagged, heavy tungsten ball bearings and fragmented steel shrapnel saturated the void. The Sovereign shield matrix flared violently, the localized repulsor nodes attempting to calculate and deflect hundreds of thousands of independent physical impacts at once. The sheer computational overload was catastrophic. The elegant, glowing shield flickered, whined, and collapsed into static. "Shields are down!" the overseer screamed on the bridge of the Aegis, the tranquil environment shattering into absolute panic as the physical noise of shrapnel began ringing against their hull. "Defensive matrices have failed. Thermal overload." "Fire the torpedoes," Harding ordered. From the belly of the Gettysburg, 4 heavy tactical nuclear torpedoes dropped free of their tubes. Their solid fuel rockets ignited, leaving thick trails of white exhaust as they accelerated across the painfully short distance between the 2 ships. Reed watched the crude, chemical-burning missiles approach. "Point defense! Vaporize them!" The Aegis fired its localized lasers, attempting to burn the missiles out of the sky. 2 of the torpedoes were caught in the crossfire, detonating prematurely in the void, washing the armor of both ships in a blinding wave of radiation and heat. But the flak cloud was too thick. The alien sensors, choked by the burning remnants of the artillery shells, failed to track the remaining 2 projectiles. The heavy torpedoes slammed directly into the side of the Aegis. They did not pierce the hull. They simply detonated on contact. The sheer, unbridled, concussive force of a localized nuclear blast in a vacuum hit the pristine silver cruiser like the fist of an angry god. The immaculate alloy of the hull warped, buckled, and tore violently inward. The internal gravimetric dampeners, designed to manage inertia, were completely blown out by the electromagnetic pulse of the detonation. Inside the sovereign vessel, the crew was thrown mercilessly against the bulkheads as the ship was physically shoved off its axis. The perfect, silent command sphere was instantly plunged into darkness, followed by the terrifying, deafening shriek of tearing metal and venting atmosphere. The Aegis spun wildly out of control, trailing a massive plume of superheated gas, shattered debris, and the frozen remnants of its invincible crew. The Aegis did not explode with the blinding atomic finality of its sister ship. The twin nuclear detonations had caved in the cruiser's port flank, shattering the pristine internal geometry and rupturing the primary plasma reserves. But the hull remained largely intact, a mangled, tumbling wreck. It spun lazily on a chaotic axis, venting a massive, frozen tail of atmosphere, vaporized coolant, and the shattered remnants of its interior decks. On the bridge of the Gettysburg, there was no cheering. The crew was too battered, too physically exhausted by the adrenaline and the deafening noise of the broadside barrage. The heavy, oppressive silence of the void crept back into the command center, broken only by the harsh, rhythmic wheezing of the overtaxed environmental scrubbers and the popping of cooling metal. Captain Thomas Harding stood slowly. His knees ached, and a sharp pain radiated through his ribs from where the shockwave had thrown him against the command console. He wiped a layer of greasy soot from his forehead and stared at the main optical feed. The emergency lighting bathed the bridge in a dim, pulsing amber hue, casting long, exhausted shadows across the faces of his officers. "Miller!" Harding rasped, his throat raw from the acrid smoke filling the compartment. "Give me a read on that cruiser. Are they dead?" David Miller leaned close to his tactile displays, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the sensor gains. "Thermal signatures are dropping rapidly, Captain. Their main reactor loop is severed. I am reading 0 electromagnetic output. No shield harmonics, no point defense tracking. They are completely without power. Life support is practically non-existent. Keep the starboard autocannons tracked on their center of mass," Harding ordered, refusing to let the tension drop completely. "If they so much as spark a thruster, I want them turned into a debris cloud. Collins, I need a sitrep on our own house. How badly are we hurting?" Rachel Collins was already pulling data from the surviving internal network. Her uniform jacket was discarded, her shirt stained with sweat, and the dark grease of the damage control boards. "We took a beating, sir. The forward ablative armor is entirely gone. The primary tungsten glacis is heavily fractured. If anyone hits us with a heavy plasma lance right now, it will core straight through to the central magazines." She paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "We lost containment on decks 9 and 10 during the particle beam barrage. Emergency bulkheads engaged. But we have 33 confirmed casualties from the decompression. Medbay is overwhelmed with blunt force trauma and localized radiation burns from the torpedo flash." Harding closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, feeling the immense, crushing weight of command settle over his shoulders. 33 men and women gone in the blink of an eye. The math of war was never clean for the victor. It was paid for in empty bunks and letters sent home. "Get the secondary medical teams down to the staging areas," Harding commanded, his voice steady, anchoring the bridge crew. "Prioritize the burn victims. Owens, what is our propulsion status?" "Port thruster array is completely offline, sir," Peter Owens replied, his hands resting limply on the manual yokes. "The housing is shattered. Starboard chemical thrusters have about 15% fuel capacity remaining. Main fusion drives are intact, but the heavy static-laced voice of Chief Engineer Arthur Reynolds suddenly barked over the ship-wide comms, answering the question before Owens could finish. "Bridge, this is engineering. Do not even think about engaging the main drive. The structural struts housing the fusion core took massive shear stress during that lateral spin maneuver. If you put standard acceleration load on the frame right now, the reactor might physically tear loose from its mounts." "Understood, Chief," Harding replied, pressing the comms toggle. "What about the magnetic rails?" Down in the sweltering bowels of the ship, Reynolds wiped a heavy rag across his face, staring at the massive, glowing husks of the primary railguns. The heat radiating from the barrels was intense enough to blister skin at 10 paces. "Tubes 1 and 2 are fused solid, Captain. The magnetic coils literally melted into the breech blocks. 3 and 4 are warped. We might be able to recalibrate them, but it'll take weeks at a dry dock. The spinal mounts are dead. We are down to secondary batteries and whatever torpedoes we have left in the tubes. Secure the magazines, Chief. Flood the forward rail housings with emergency coolant before the ambient heat cooks off our remaining ordnance. Good work down there." "Aye, Captain." Reynolds out. Harding looked back at the main screen. The Gettysburg was crippled, heavily damaged, and practically immobile. But it was alive. Through the thick, armored viewports of the internal cameras, he could see the massive, scarred nose of his dreadnought. The dark grey metal was scorched black, melted in places, and violently cratered in others. It was an ugly, brutal machine. But out there in the dark, 3 perfect, mathematically flawless alien warships were nothing more than expanding clouds of frozen dust. "We held the line," Harding murmured, almost to himself. He turned to Miller. "David, try to push a signal through the radiation interference. See if anyone is still alive on the colony down there." The atmosphere of New Roanoke was a turbulent sea of ash and localized firestorms. The Sovereign bombardment had boiled the upper stratosphere, leaving behind a thick, toxic soup of ionized gas and carbon particulate. Pushing a standard radio signal through that mess was like trying to shout through a concrete wall. "I'm routing the transmission through the surviving orbital buoys," Miller said, his fingers working rapidly across the manual frequency dials. "Boosting signal strength, splicing through the standard emergency bands. It's heavily degraded, but I think I have a carrier wave." A burst of harsh, screaming static filled the bridge, making the crew wince. Then, beneath the white noise, the faint, rhythmic cadence of a human voice broke through. "Repeat, this is Planetary Command Bunker Alpha. We are blind on orbital telemetry. Atmospheric scrubbers are failing. If any UN vessels are receiving this broadcast, the Sovereign Fleet is glassing the Northern Hemisphere. We require immediate..." "Surface Command. This is Captain Thomas Harding of the UNS Gettysburg." Harding spoke clearly into the primary receiver. "Do you copy?" The static peaked, then abruptly cleared. The voice on the other end caught in its throat. "Gettysburg. This is Major William Cole, Planetary Defense Forces. Captain, we lost orbital tracking 20 minutes ago. We thought the defense grid was completely wiped out. Are the hostile cruisers still in orbit?" "Negative, Major Cole," Harding replied, a profound sense of exhaustion seeping into his tone. "The airspace above New Roanoke is clear. I repeat, the Sovereign cruisers have been neutralized." There was a long pause on the radio. When Cole spoke again, his voice was tight, thick with disbelief. "Neutralized? Captain, our intelligence said those ships were impenetrable. How did you break their thermal shields?" "We didn't use heat, Major. We used mass," Harding said simply. "What is your situation on the ground?" "It's grim, sir," Cole reported. "The civilian shelters in Sector 4 and 5 held against the plasma saturation. but the surface infrastructure is gone. We have thousands trapped beneath the rubble, and our atmospheric processes are choked with ash. We need heavy lift equipment and medical supplies. Understood, Harding said. We are heavily damaged ourselves, but we will deploy our remaining dropships with engineering crews and medical personnel. Hang tight, Major. You aren't alone anymore. Copy that, Gettysburg. And thank you, Captain. Cole out. Harding stepped back from the console, rubbing his eyes. The battle was over, but the work was just beginning. Captain, Miller spoke up, his voice sharp, breaking the momentary relief on the bridge. I am detecting a localized high-frequency transmission. It's a tight beam burst, cutting right through the background radiation. Harding snapped to attention. Source? It's coming from the Aegis, Miller reported, isolating the signal on his secondary screen. The wreck. They must have an emergency beacon running on a localized battery backup. It's transmitting on a highly compressed frequency, aimed directly out of the Gamma Pavonis system. Can you jam it? Negative, sir. It's already gone. It bounced off a deep space relay before I could even isolate the carrier wave. The burst lasted less than a microsecond. Collins stepped up to the tactical table, her expression grim. A distress signal? Worse, Miller said, decoding the packet headers. It's a telemetry log, sensor data, shield impact analytics. The internal analytical engines of the Aegis packaged the entire combat record of this engagement and fired it back to the Sovereign High Command. A heavy silence descended over the bridge once more. The Sovereign fleet had built their empire on mathematical certainty. They had believed warfare was a solved equation. They operated under the assumption that energy was the absolute, final currency of combat. Today, the Gettysburg had introduced a new variable. They had shown the aliens the terrifying reality of kinetic trauma, heavy armor, and the sheer, stubborn grit of a species that refused to burn. But now, the aliens knew. They have the data, Collins said quietly. They know about the railguns. They know about the ablative armor. They know we use solid mass. Harding stared at the optical feed, looking at the mangled, drifting corpse of the Aegis. The elegant silver metal was torn and jagged, utterly ruined by the brutal application of human engineering. Let them have the data, Harding said, his voice dropping to a low, uncompromising gravel. Let them analyze every frame of that telemetry. Let their high command watch their invincible cruisers get torn to shreds by an iron box. We didn't just break their ships today. We broke their perfect equation. Harding turned away from the screen, his posture straightening despite the pain in his ribs. The exhaustion was still there, but it was replaced by a hardened, cold resolve. Collins, prep the dropships for planetary relief, Harding ordered, stepping back to his command chair. Miller, run a passive scan over the alien debris fields. I want salvage teams out there as soon as the radiation levels drop. If they are going to study our railguns, we are going to study their gravimetric dampeners. If we can adapt their tech to our heavy armor, the next ship we build won't just take a punch. It'll be unstoppable. Harding sat down heavily in the command chair, looking around at the battered, soot-stained faces of his crew. They were bruised, battered, and standing in a ship that was barely holding its own atmosphere, but they had survived the fire. The galaxy thought they mastered war, Harding said, his eyes scanning the dark horizon of space beyond the viewport. We're going to teach them exactly how wrong they are. The hangar bay of the UNS Gettysburg was a cavernous, echoing vault of utilitarian design, and right now it sounded like a heavy manufacturing plant pushed past the breaking point. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning electrical insulation and the harsh metallic tang of spilled hydraulic fluid. Maintenance crews, covered in grease and sweat, sprinted across the scarred deck plates, hauling heavy supply crates and dragging welding torches toward the fleet of dropships. Lieutenant Sarah Davies strapped herself into the pilot's seat of Drop Shuttle 4, pulling the heavy, 5-point harness tight across her chest. Her shuttle, like the dreadnought that housed it, had not escaped the battle unscathed. The outer hull was scorched black from secondary thermal bloom, and the portside landing strut groaned an agonizing metallic protest as the cargo ramp sealed shut behind 36 heavily armed engineers and trauma medics. "Clear for launch, Lieutenant." The deck boss's voice crackled through her helmet comms, barely audible over the roaring thrum of the shuttle's thrusters warming up. "Atmospheric entry is going to be rough. The planetary weather grid is completely destabilized. Watch the sheer winds." "Copy that, Control," Davies replied, her hands gripping the physical flight yokes. She didn't rely on automated landing algorithms. The Sovereign bombardment had wiped out the planetary beacons anyway. This was going to be a manual, brute force insertion. Drop Shuttle 4, detached and breaking the magnetic seal. The heavy bay doors ground open, revealing the absolute black of space and the massive, angry, swirling brown and grey bruise that was the atmosphere of New Roanoke. Davies punched the thrusters, and the heavy shuttle dropped out of the dreadnought's belly, diving straight into the toxic soup of the dying world below. The turbulence hit them immediately. The shuttle violently shuddered, the heavy atmospheric plating rattling as Davies fought the chaotic wind shear. Outside the thick plasteel viewport, the sky was not the comforting blue of a terrestrial world, but a dark, suffocating canopy of ash and ionized fire. Lightning, born from the friction of billions of tons of suspended particulate matter, flashed violently across the clouds. "Holding vector," Davies muttered, her arms straining against the heavy feedback of the controls. "We are dropping through the troposphere. I have visual on the surface. Below them, New Roanoke was a landscape of devastation. The pristine modular colony structures had been reduced to jagged craters and fused slag. But amidst the ruin, scattered pockets of survivors had dragged emergency floodlights out of the subterranean bunkers, creating small, desperate islands of light in the suffocating dark. Davies brought the heavy shuttle down with a jarring thud, the landing strut sinking deep into the layer of fine, grey ash covering the ground. Before the engines even fully spooled down, the rear ramp dropped. Humanity poured out into the ruin. Major William Cole stood near the edge of a massive debris field, his uniform torn and caked in dust. He watched as the UN medics rushed past him, carrying heavy trauma kits and portable stasis pods. Behind them came the engineers, strapped into heavy industrial exosuits. These weren't weapons of war. They were construction rigs, towering frames of raw hydraulic muscle designed for deep-core mining. An engineer in a yellow-painted exosuit stomped up to a collapsed ferrocrete slab that weighed upward of 20 tons, pinning a dozen colonists in a ruined sublevel. The machine locked its heavy clamps onto the jagged edges of the slab. The hydraulic pistons shrieked, thick steel cables pulling taut. Slowly, agonizingly, the massive slab shifted, then lifted, groaning against the sheer mechanical force being applied to it. Dust cascaded from the edges, and the medics immediately scrambled into the newly opened gap. Cole watched the process, a lump forming in his throat. The Sovereign fleet had looked down from orbit and seen a mathematical certainty. They had calculated the thermal energy required to exterminate the population and applied it. What their analytical engines could never compute was the sheer, stubborn, irrational refusal of humanity to stay buried. Meanwhile, back in the cold vacuum of orbit, a different kind of recovery operation was underway. Sergeant Thomas Brooks floated through the frozen, silent graveyard of the Aegis. He wore a heavy, Mark IV extravehicular activity suit, a bulky armored spacesuit that made him look like a deep-sea diver. his magnetic boots locked onto the shattered edge of a sovereign bulkhead with a heavy, reassuring thud. The contrast between the two species was starkly evident here. The alien wreckage was a testament to elegant design. Even torn to shreds, the silver alloy was perfectly smooth, the severed energy conduits glowing with a faint, dying luminescence. There were no wires, no visible bolts, no industrial welds. It was art, shattered by a sledgehammer. Brooks ignited his heavy plasma cutter, the bright blue flame casting harsh, flickering shadows across the pristine wreckage. He was standing near the aft section of the ruined cruiser, hovering over a large, intact cylindrical housing that the Gettysburg scanners had identified as the primary gravimetric dampener core. "I've got eyes on the prize, Actual," Brooks reported over the encrypted comms line, his breathing loud inside his helmet. "The housing is solid. I don't see any localized power flowing through the outer matrix, moving in to cut the primary mounts." "Take it slow, Sergeant," Captain Harding's voice replied in his ear. "If that core still holds a residual charge, I don't want you getting crushed by a localized gravity well. Cut the structural supports and let the salvage drone haul it out." "Roger that." Brooks pressed the cutter against the silver alloy. The alien metal resisted the heat for a fraction of a second before giving way, turning molten and sparking violently into the vacuum. He worked methodically, a blue-collar worker dismantling the pinnacle of galactic engineering with raw heat and elbow grease. Back on the bridge of the Gettysburg, Harding stood before the main tactical display, watching the split feeds. On the left monitor, the heavy exosuits on New Roanoke were tearing apart the rubble, pulling survivors from the ashes of a glassed world. On the right, his salvage teams were physically ripping the technological heart out of an invincible alien warship. Rachel Collins walked up to stand beside him, her arms crossed over her chest. The bridge was finally cooling down, the emergency scrubbers having cleared the worst of the smoke, though the smell of scorched iron still lingered heavily in the air. "The salvage teams are securing the first core," Collins reported softly. "Engineering thinks they can crack the casing within the week. If we understand how they manipulate mass and inertia, we mount it on a ship twice the size of this one." Harding finished the thought, his eyes never leaving the screens. "With armor 3 times as thick, we bolt their elegance to our brute force." The Sovereign Fleet had broadcast the data of their defeat back to their high command. They were machines of logic, and they would adapt. They would learn that humanity used physical mass, and they would try to develop countermeasures. They would prepare for a war of kinetic trauma. But humanity was already adapting, too. The galaxy had existed in a state of stagnant, mathematical perfection for thousands of years. We had just kicked the door down, dragging all our messy, loud, industrial fury with us. The Sovereign Fleet believed they had mastered war because they had never faced an enemy that built their ships the same way they fought, with raw knuckles, thick skin, and a complete disregard for the odds. Harding looked out the forward viewport, past the scarred, ugly nose of the Gettysburg, into the deep, endless black of the cosmos. They wanted a war. Now, they were going to get one. Thank you so much for watching this HFY Sci-Fi story. If you loved seeing human grit and heavy tungsten armor shatter the perfect equations of an alien armada, make sure to hit that like button and share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans. What did you think of the Gettysburg's brutal tactics? Drop a comment down below and let us know your favorite part of the battle. Your support truly helps the channel grow and allows us to bring you more epic tales of human resilience. Subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss our next upload.